Patrick Meier is somebody I've been stalking for the last 3 years. He'll tell you that for sure because I've contacted him 3 years straight and was finally able to get our schedules to coincide. Actually, he had to pull some strings to make it coincide. So we're going to do this very quickly. He's got a very, very hard stop that he's got to go. He's got to catch a cab and he's got to go back to the meeting and then back to the airport. Patrick is an internationally recognized thought leader on humanitarian technologies and innovation. His new book, Digital Humanitarians, has been endorsed by Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Oxford, the UN, Red Cross, World Bank, USAID, and others. Over the past 12 years, Patrick has worked all over the world, including places like Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Somalia, Libya, India, Nepal, Philippines, Turkey, Morocco, Western Sahara, Haiti, Northern Ireland, and a wide range of humanitarian projects and multiple organizations like the United Nations and World Bank. In 2010, he was publicly recognized by Bill Clinton for his pioneering digital humanitarian effort, which he continues to this day. Patrick's work has been featured in the world's top newspapers and magazines like New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, and magazines like Time, New Yorker, NPR, Wired, and Scientific American, just to name a few. There was a long list, and that's about all I can say. His influential and widely read blog, iRevolutions, has received over 1.7 million hits, and he tweets at Patrick Meier. So please, let's welcome Patrick to the stage. We're very excited to have him. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, you're set. Thank you so much.
Hi all, can you hear me all right? Yes? Super, thank you. Thanks so much for such a warm welcome, Richard. It's a real pleasure and a real treat to be here. This is clearly an important flagship GIS event, such an honor. It's been going on for almost 30 years, 28 years. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to speak at such an incredible event. So thanks again for the warm welcome, and Kathy as well for the very kind invitation and hospitality. I should come right out and probably confess up front that my name is Patrick. I'm not a GIS professional. I have been working at the intersection of technology and geography for a good 10 years, but as a digital humanitarian. But that doesn't really qualify us as GIS professionals. You are the GIS professionals. You are the ones who are innovating, who are driving this industry, the research, the technology, and so on. So we need all the help we can get from all of you. So this is really an open invitation to connect, to work together, to collaborate. I think we can do some really powerful work together. And to give you a sense of maybe what kind of work we might be able to do, I wanted to share my story and the projects that I've been involved in and invite you to help us do what we're doing, but better. So my story is a personal story. It begins on a very specific date, January 12th, 2010. Which is when a major devastating earthquake struck Port-au-Prince, and I remembered it as if it were just yesterday. I was in my dorm room at Tufts University in Boston, and I had CNN in the background. I was catching up on work on my laptop, and then all of a sudden, breaking news, major earthquake, Port-au-Prince, and I went in an immediate state of shock, panic, anxiety, because this was very personal. You see, my soon-to-be wife was in Port-au-Prince at the time, doing research for grad school. So I immediately ran for my cell phone, called, no answer. Text messages, no answer. On email, no answer. On social media, Twitter, Facebook, no sign. Skype, I tried everything I could. And so you can imagine just how many emotions were running through me. I mean, I don't think I've ever had to feel like that before. And I had to do something. It was really paralyzing, and I was frankly freaking out. And I just figured I'd just do anything at this point, anything. I couldn't bear the thought of just waiting for news. And so I launched what is called a crisis map. And I wanted to basically decide, okay, I'll just map where the damage is. I'll map where the needs are. And where did I get that information from? Well, it was all on social media. When I went on Facebook and on Twitter looking for my wife, I saw many Haitians and many internationals in Haiti tweeting live, bearing witness to the devastation, and also on Facebook posting pictures. So I went back on social media and I started mapping what I could from this information. There were some geographical clues sometimes. They would say, oh, the orphanage at this particular location has been damaged, or the church and the name of the church has collapsed. With a little detective work, was able to get some of the geographic coordinates for these reports of damage and needs. And it wasn't until 1 a.m. that morning that I finally got a text message back, and my wife was okay. She'd narrowly escaped collapsing building. So you can imagine, I mean, I just bawled. I just broke down at that point. And after a few minutes of that, if not longer, I just decided, well, okay, that was lucky, and the vast majority of people in Haiti were certainly not nearly as lucky. And so at 1 a.m., I decided, well, I'm just going to continue mapping. And by then, I had a few friends who joined me on Skype because they'd gotten wind of what I was doing. And so they were helping me out. And it wasn't, the morning happened. We didn't go to sleep. The sun breaks in Boston and in Haiti. And then social media goes absolutely nuts. I mean, just explodes with user-generated content related to Haiti. And the mainstream media goes 24/7 as well. And in hindsight, this was really our first battle with big data. This was the first digital humanitarian battle with big data. We were completely overwhelmed. And so I sent an email to our student listserv and said, hey, we're mapping Haiti. We need all the help we can get. We just can't keep up with all the content that's being generated. And frankly, much to my surprise, that late afternoon, I had a dozen friends and complete strangers show up in my dorm room to help me map Haiti. And we stayed up that whole night again, just mapping. And it was very tedious. It wasn't easy to do because, frankly, it was all manual. We were literally copying and pasting tweets and Facebook updates and news articles into a Google spreadsheet. And then we would have other teams, volunteers, look for GPS coordinates. And then other teams take that and put it on a crisis map. But even then, with these dozens and dozens of volunteers who showed up, and strangers and neighbors showing up, we still couldn't manage this overflow of information. So we sent out an email to other departments and to the entire undergraduate student body at Tufts University. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students and friends of students and family members showed up at Tufts University in the seminar rooms and the lecture rooms where we were giving crash courses in how to do this kind of live crisis mapping, which frankly, we were making it up as we went along. None of us had done anything quite like this. It was an emotional reaction, and we were just trying to make sense of this torrent of information that was available online. And at the height of our operations, the crisis map looked exactly like this. So this was a screenshot I took at the time. And see, the number 22 here corresponds to 22 individual reports of damage or needs in that specific location. So if you were to zoom in, you'd see those 22 reports coming from mainstream media, coming from social media. We were mapping pictures as well. So this was really a map like no other that I had personally seen, because this map did not look the same for more than 10 minutes at a time, because you had hundreds of volunteers, and at this point, from all around the world, adding content. It was like a living, growing, evolving organism. And why all around the world? Well, because we had students we had exchange students at Tufts University who got back in touch with their home universities in the UK, in Switzerland, and elsewhere, and say, hey, this is what we're doing at Tufts. Can you please put together a situation room and help us map Haiti as well? So it became a global, online, rapid, people-powered digital disaster response agency that we just put together in no time. And it really was something that was not static. So this is just an animation of some of the reports we were mapping over the course of several days and in fact several weeks. But of course, most Haitians are not on social media. But the vast majority of Haitian households, and this was already true in 2010, have access to mobile phones. So we knew that if we wanted to really have more of an impact, we needed an SMS solution. And through a series of just coincidences, accidents, good luck, we were able to secure a Haitian SMS number, 4636, that enabled anyone in Haiti to text us for free with their needs and their location. Now, just like everything else we'd done until this point, we were just making it up. We had no idea what this would end up as being as what would happen, whether it would be useful, frankly, or if it would even work. But we figured, okay, if we do start getting some text messages, they're probably going to be in Haitian Creole, and none of us, the humanitarian community, doesn't speak a word of Haitian Creole. So through some other good fortunes and great connections, long story short, we were able to recruit over 1,000 Creole-speaking volunteers in 41 countries around the world. The vast majority are coming from the Haitian diaspora. And sure enough, after we launched this and word got around through local community radio stations in Port-au-Prince, we started receiving thousands and thousands of text messages. By the end of the first week, a good 10,000 messages had been translated and shared with us to be posted on our map. And this is a wordle of the more frequent words that appeared in these text messages. And it's really powerful for me every time I look at this, because here you have a very traumatized population that almost certainly is, families have lost loved ones, and they're still saying, please, thank you, help. And I think that's really, really powerful. Shockingly, a week or so later, we see this tweet getting circulated from Craig Fugate, who is the administrator of FEMA, as I'm sure many of you know, referring to our map as the most comprehensive and up-to-date resource available to the humanitarian community. And really, my reaction was, wait, what? Are you kidding? Are you serious? This was all volunteer-driven. It was a global volunteer, student-driven movement with a grand total budget of $0. So it was just sweat and tears and iron will and a lot of digital goodwill that made this happen. So we were really, it felt incredibly validating, but in hindsight, this also put a lot of pressure on us, because all of a sudden, the mainstream media went wild with respect to our work, and a bit too much, to be honest. And if this weren't even surreal enough, a week or so later, we found out that the US Marine Corps was making use of our map operationally, and they sent us an email at the time, which they've since given us permission to make public. And in this email, they write, this is not me writing, this is the Marine Corps saying that they used our map operationally, which helped them save hundreds of lives. So what ended up happening, they would use the map to literally send out search and rescue helicopters and search and rescue teams to these locations where we had reports of people being buried under the rubble. And this is still way too surreal for me. I still can't quite, believe it. But this is what ended up happening from a purely emotional reaction. But this entire story would not have been possible were it not for another equally powerful map and some amazing digital humanitarians. You see, when we were mapping these tweets and these text messages and so on, we were using Google Maps at first. But if you had gone to Google Maps for Port-au-Prince in 2010, half of Port-au-Prince was missing. And it was not a priority potentially for Google Inc., or they hadn't gotten around to it. So we needed another option. And this is where the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap community got together, managed to acquire, through the World Bank and other sources, high-resolution satellite imagery post-earthquake, and then started crowdsourcing the tracing of the satellite images of the roads, the little path and so on from Port-au-Prince, and working with the Haitian diaspora to find out what these streets and little paths were called across Port-au-Prince. And this is an animation of this crowdsourcing in action. Remember, the earthquake happens on January 12th. And every flash of light here, there are 1.4 million flashes of light that represent individual traces made by some volunteer around the world. And again, it feels like a living, breathing organism, right? Like synapses going off in the brain. And within just 5 days of this crowdsourcing, that crowdsourced map of Port-au-Prince, Haiti, was more detailed than the Google Maps version. So we pivoted onto this particular OpenStreetMap as our base map for our operations. And like I said, it got way too much media coverage. But now and ever since the Haiti earthquake, when I look at a crisis map like this one, a crowdsourced crisis map, I don't only just see just dots on a map. What I really see are all the incredible people, the incredible volunteers from all around the world who mobilized online to help others in need on the other side of the planet, just because they wanted to and they could. It was an incredible surge of digital goodwill, which goes to show you what you can do when you have the technology. But it's not just a technology story. The story of digital humanitarians that I recount in my book is as much, if not more, story about humanity and about people caring. That map would be empty. There would be no dots on that map were it not because somebody cared and took the time to add information to that map. So we hear about technology dehumanizing. We in the news every day about how we use technology to harass each other, to spy on each other, to do all kinds of cruel things to each other. But there's a completely different narrative here, which I hope you'll agree is very powerful and exists. This technology doesn't have to be dehumanizing. It actually can make us more human by extending our humanity. We are no longer bounded by borders and space, right? Somebody in Peru can volunteer in Haiti. Somebody in Japan can volunteer in Haiti. It really helps to extend our humanity in many different ways. So that was 5 years ago, right? Half a decade. And if we thought big data was a challenge then today we're dealing with some serious challenges around this massive overflow of information. You see, humanitarian organizations for decades and decades and decades evolved out of a climate or an environment that's characterized by the top picture here, one of information scarcity, where you're dealing with barren information landscapes so that when disasters happen, we don't know who's been affected, how badly, where, for weeks. It just takes so much time. And what's happening now is that humanitarian organizations are facing what I call a kind of climate change. Not maybe the kind of climate we're talking about, but a data climate change, a climate change in data, where they're no longer dealing as much. It still exists. We do have information deserts. I completely want to acknowledge that up front. But we're increasingly moving to a world of total information overload, just torrents and floods of information. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear to humanitarian organizations that this overflow of information that gets generated during disasters can be as paralyzing to humanitarian efforts as the absence of information. So we're actually no better off in either of these different data environments. And frankly, humanitarian organizations are completely unprepared to deal with this new reality. They have never had to deal with overflow. They've been spending a lot of time in these information deserts. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, the crux of the challenge here, in many respects, is how do you find the information that matters in these massive stacks of information that get generated during disasters? How do you find those proverbial needles? Because the vast majority of the content, especially the user-generated content that gets generated, is not directly actionable or is not really useful for situational awareness. So how do we find those pieces of potentially life-saving information, those small pieces of information that could make a huge difference? It's a huge challenge, and increasingly so compared to 2010, because we're dealing with even more social media platforms, and not just text-based information, but also pictures and videos. So a wide variety and volume and velocity of information getting generated. Now, how did we make sense of this in Haiti? Well, we got all our good friends together, and we just rushed that haystack, right? Not because it was the smartest thing to do, but just because it's the only thing we could do, at least that we could think of doing. There were no super-duper platforms that could help us magically identify where those needles were and so on. Now, this is fun for the first 5 minutes, but it can get very tiring, and in fact, it's a great recipe for complete burnout, and it's really tedious, manually intensive. So crowdsourcing alone is not going to be the sole solution to the big data challenge that we face in the digital humanitarian space. We're going to need something else, especially because we're not just talking about one stack of information that gets generated during disasters. We're talking about multiple stacks of information. And in fact, it's a lot more difficult than that. The situation is even worse, because we're not dealing with nicely structured, packaged pieces of information. We're dealing with completely unstructured information, basically a meadow of information that stretches from horizon to horizon. And if you actually go back to the original, looking for a needle in a haystack from St. Thomas More in the 16th century, the original Latin was actually kind of mistranslated. It's actually, when he writes this, he writes about looking for a needle in a meadow, which is far more apropos to the challenge that we face in the digital humanitarian space to try and make sense of this big crisis data. This doesn't mean that crowdsourcing on its own is useless. It is a very important part of the answer, but it's not the only answer. We need crowdsourcing with a little AI, with a little artificial intelligence. And that might sound somewhat like science fiction, but fact is the United Nations has been using artificial intelligence for the past couple of years during disasters to make sense of big data. And I wanted to share with you some of the latest examples of this from real-world examples, namely, for example, the Nepal earthquake that struck in April of this year. What was very different, it's almost 5 years to the month of the Haiti earthquake. So 5 years is a long time in the technology space, as we all know. And unlike the Haiti situation, where we were purely reacting, it was a very reactive kind of approach. In 2015, we had the Digital Humanitarian Network, which is a network I co-founded with the United Nations a few years back in order to leverage this incredible digital goodwill that exists around the world, composed of dozens and dozens of organizations. And this Digital Humanitarian Network has since become the official interface between established dinosaur-like humanitarian organizations, big bureaucracies, and very agile, decentralized, distributed, tech-savvy volunteers from all around the world. And in many respects, the Digital Humanitarian Network are the superheroes of digital humanitarian action. We've got some of them focusing on satellite imagery. They've got great skills and superpowers with making sense of satellite imagery. Others focus on building GIS maps, and others focus on making sense of social media and so on. Perhaps the biggest difference, however, between the Avengers and the digital humanitarian space is that the vast majority of digital humanitarians are women. Time and time again since Haiti, the vast majority are women. So the digital humanitarian movement is very much a women-driven movement. So what happened with Nepal was the UN activated the Digital Humanitarian Network with a number of asks. One, please identify all tweets from Nepal that refer to urgent needs, and also look at all pictures posted on social media and on mainstream media, and find out which of these pictures show disaster damage and where in Nepal these pictures were taken. This would have been a near impossible task 5 years ago. But this time we were able to use a new platform that my team and I have developed in partnership with the United Nations, a platform called MicroMappers, which is a free and open source tool that specifically combines crowdsourcing with artificial intelligence to make sense of these different data stacks that get generated, text-based pictures, videos, satellite imagery, and so on. So we deployed MicroMappers within hours of the earthquake. And if you were a digital humanitarian volunteer, or a digital Jedi, as the UN likes to call them, this is what you would see. It's actually really quite simple. This is a screenshot. If you had been volunteering your time, even 5 minutes, you'd see a tweet. We would automatically post tweets to MicroMappers, and then we would simply be asking our digital Jedis to tag the appropriate category. What category best describes this tweet, if any? And these information needs are not our needs. Those were communicated directly by the United Nations. This is what they wanted to know. This is what they needed to know. Super simple, right? Single click. That's as easy as it is to be a digital humanitarian today. Very different from the crowded Google spreadsheets, manual kind of intensive work we were doing 5 years ago. But this is the crowdsourcing part. So thinking again about rushing that haystack. Fun for 5 minutes, and after a while it gets kind of old rather quickly. Which is why AIDR comes in, AIDR, Artificial Intelligence for Disaster Response, another free and open source platform that my team and I have been developing. And what AIDR does is it's an intelligent machine learning engine. It sits behind MicroMappers, and it looks at what these digital Jedis are doing. It looks at these 3 buckets of information, of urgent needs, infrastructure damage, and population displacement, and it sees how these digital Jedis are placing the tweets in these 3 different buckets. So it'll look in the bucket of urgent needs, and it'll see, okay, these 72 tweets that have just been tagged and placed in this bucket as urgent needs, I'm starting to see a pattern. So AIDR uses a technique from AI called statistical machine learning, real-time statistical machine learning, to figure out what the pattern is. Why do those tweets belong in that bucket? And then once those buckets are full enough, AIDR can automatically go ahead and tag future tweets, up to 2 million tweets an hour if need be. And 2 million is a little overkill for now, but give it another 6 to 12 months, and maybe we're not going to be good enough with just 2 million tweets an hour. Now, most people, again, don't have or do not use social media on the planet, which is why we've modified the AIDR platform to work with SMS. So AIDR SMS has been used by UNICEF over the past few months and successfully piloted by UNICEF. So other partners from the World Food Program and the International Federation of the Red Cross are going to be piloting this as well, because they're receiving tens of thousands of text messages for their programs in not only disasters, but for disaster preparedness, early recovery, reconstruction, and so on. I mentioned that the other ask we received from the UN was pictures. Identify pictures on social and mainstream media that show disaster damage. Again, if you'd been a digital Jedi helping out in MicroMappers, this is what you would have seen. It's very simple. How much damage do you see in this picture? You tag the appropriate circle. It really is that simple. And like tweets, in fact, what we do is we show every picture to at least 3 or 5 different volunteers. And only if there's consensus that this tweet really corresponds to urgent need, or this picture has 5 votes, 5 buttons, 5 clicks that suggest it's severe damage, do we take that information and bring it to the next step. Now again, haystack, rushing, fun for 5 minutes, which is why, again, what we're doing now is we're working with some computer vision students to see if we can teach the algorithm how to recognize disaster damage, or at least buildings and shelters, houses in pictures. This really represents, from what I've learned from my computer vision colleagues, quite the cutting edge in terms of R&D and computer vision research. It's possible. The industry has done it. We're just catching up in the humanitarian space. Now, what do we do with all this information that we've filtered? We place them on maps. And I guess this is where the mapping geography comes in, right? Not because we just like maps and maps are fun, but because information is not necessarily actionable if it doesn't have a GPS coordinate. Whether it's super precise or not doesn't really matter. But telling the UN that a bridge has been destroyed in Kathmandu is pointless. That's not actionable. They don't have time to figure out which bridge. That's why these maps are really, really important. And again, it's important with crowdsourced maps not just to see these dots, but to realize how much incredible digital goodwill has gone into building these maps. And in the case of Nepal, we had some 3,000 digital Jedis in some 90 countries around the world. This is where they were volunteering from, come together to help support the relief efforts that our UN partners were asking support for. Incredible human story here again, and together they clocked some 300,000 clicks on MicroMappers in just a matter of days. I mean, truly amazing example of what we can do online when we've got the appropriate platforms to channel that digital goodwill in an effective and impactful way. So those were like kind of ground-based sensors. And I want to go to videos and imagery now and go a little further up in the air and talk about aerial sensors. And I was so excited when I was walking around to see some references and pictures of UAVs and seeing some of the talks that also lined up. Really exciting to see that. This technology is also starting to play a really important role in the digital humanitarian space. And we know that technology is not going away anytime soon. The latest industry statistics clearly show an upward trend. Just this year, by the end of this year, some 4 million plus consumer UAVs or consumer drones are being sold around the world. And this is probably an underestimate. And if you really want proof that this data is becoming more and more prevalent, you can go to Travel by Drones. It's a phenomenal website where thousands and thousands of people all around the world have uploaded their aerial videos that they've captured themselves. You can see just how busy the content is across the US and also Europe. It is a very exciting technology. It is becoming increasingly democratized. Not quite there yet, right? So if you go to Guyana, there's not much activity, but looks can be somewhat deceiving, because if we do go to Guyana, this beautiful rainforests of Guyana, you'll find that a local indigenous community, the Wapichanas, have been building their own fixed-wing UAV with a little help from some friends of mine. This is middle of Guyana in the rainforest, and this is a short video of their first maiden flights, which I wanted to share with you.
That's perfect. Yeah. You want to pose? I think you can almost just let go.
Nobody said innovation was easy. But if at first you don't succeed, try again. And the reason that this local indigenous community are using these UAVs is to capture evidence of illegal deforestation and illegal mining in their rainforests, and bringing that to the attention of the government and showing them concrete concrete proof. So from the rainforests of Guyana to the beautiful deserts of Namibia, where some friends of mine have been working with a wildlife Kuzikus reserve with rangers to help them improve their wildlife protection efforts. There are huge poaching issues across all of southern Africa, certainly not in Namibia alone. And what they've done, they spent weeks flying these UAVs, these fixed-wing UAVs. They weigh about 600, 700 grams, covering the entire wildlife reserve so that these rangers would get a better understanding of, well, what do we have in this reserve and how many do we have? You can't protect if you don't know what you have. So they did this incredible work, and I got involved towards the end when the pictures had all been collected and the rangers were starting to look through a few hundred of them, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands. And it was clear, the rangers told me themselves, that it was going to take them months to go through all these images because, frankly, they need to be out in the bush protecting the wildlife. They can't be spending weeks, 9 to 5, behind computers and laptops looking for this imagery. So I had a light bulb moment, and I said, well, why don't you give us the imagery? We'll modify the MicroMappers platform, and we'll post the imagery there, and we'll invite digital volunteers from all around the world to help us search for the wildlife, for Namibia's wildlife. And this is exactly a real picture that we had posted, and we invited volunteers to draw these shields, as we called them, around the wildlife, around these giraffes and these rhinos. And the crowd went wild. There was such an interest from all around the world that we thought it was going to take us 3 days, really, to go through these thousands and thousands of high-resolution images. And keep in mind, we were showing every image to 5 different volunteers, so there's a lot of content. In less than 24 hours, the pictures had been done, and the people who had signed up to volunteer on day 2 had nothing to do, and they were really upset and very, very not happy that they had no animals to look for. And we had 2 middle schools from Texas who participated in this as well. And we got a lot of media coverage as well, which was so validating for these middle school students. And we had retired professionals. We had everybody and in between, all walks of life coming together to help search for Namibia's wildlife, to support these rangers in their wildlife protection efforts. And then what we did is work with some of these computer vision students again. And we thought, OK, can we take all these traces, all these shields of the animals, and maybe teach an algorithm to recognize animals? Because if we can do this even faster, it might be interesting. And sure enough, I'm very excited to announce that we can now automatically detect gazelles, which is a first step. Not very helpful for disaster response, but a proof of concept nevertheless. And one of the most gratifying results of all of this was at the end of this crowdsourcing effort, I had mentioned that the rangers had started looking at a few hundred pictures, and they realized that they had overlooked animals. They had not seen some of the animals in these early pictures, whereas the crowd had no problem. These middle schoolers here in Texas had seen the gazelles, had seen the antelopes. And that's an incredible story for me, just to say that it's not an either-or. It is really about the professionals working together with digital humanitarians, or digital rangers in this case. I want to bring it back to the humanitarian space and let you know how we took this work in Namibia and brought it to the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, which was a high-end Category 5 typhoon. I mean, just devastating results. I was seconded to the United Nations to support their relief efforts. And within about a week of my being in Manila, I had come across half a dozen UAV teams. And this was just shocking, unprecedented. This much use of aerial robotics after a disaster none of us had seen this kind of response. But it also became clear that most of these teams did not know about each other. They weren't really sharing imagery with each other. Talk about data sharing here. We'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. And by the way, they weren't even sharing imagery with local authorities, let alone local communities either. And I found that a little troubling. And when I went online and I Googled disaster response, UAVs, code of conduct, nothing. 0. There was nothing I could email back to these UAV teams and say, please, keep in mind the do's and don'ts here. So I decided after leaving the Philippines to launch this humanitarian UAV network in order to help promote and enable the safe, responsible, and effective use of UAVs in a wide range of humanitarian and development settings. And we pursue this mission with some guidance from some outstanding advisory board members. Here are just some of our humanitarian advisors from the United Nations, the World Bank, the American Red Cross, and many others. We also benefit from guidance provided by our technology partners, including DJI, Google X, CNN. CNN just launched CNN Air, by the way. It's a dedicated UAV team, and they've been phenomenal partners already. So we've been very lucky in already having been endorsed by the United Nations for the work that we're looking to do to facilitate the effective, safe, ethical use of these technologies in humanitarian settings. And we've engaged with each of these organizations. And I should say, each of these organizations are already actively exploring the use of aerial robotics, of UAVs for humanitarian settings. And in fact, a large number of them are already piloting UAVs. UNICEF is going to start in Malawi in the next month or two. As part of UAVators, what we've done is we've launched this crowdsourced crisis map of aerial pictures and aerial videos of disaster zones, being inspired directly by the Travel by Drone website. And what we've really come to realize, there's 600 plus aerial videos and pictures, dozens of aerial videos of post-earthquake Nepal on there. We've realized that a lot of this content gets shared on social media. So I'm increasingly referring to this data as aerial social media. It is user-generated content posted and shared on social media. And the reason we've provided this service is to potentially help increase situational awareness, but also it's the single largest repository of aerial data. It's ripe for computer vision research to do automated feature detection algorithms. We also work with Mapbox and Open Aerial Map. We've got streamlined workflows on collecting the imagery, where we post this imagery, how we analyze it, how we pull it out. And again here, open data and data sharing. The whole digital humanitarian story would not exist if it weren't for open data and sharing. Simply wouldn't. I wouldn't be on stage here. We also, as part of our humanitarian UAV network, we get involved directly in disaster response efforts. We carry out humanitarian UAV missions across the world. This was back in March, another Category 5 disaster, this time a Category 5 cyclone devastating the islands of Vanuatu. And UAVators was activated by the World Bank to carry out an aerial survey of the disaster-affected areas. And so we have our own dedicated roster of some 400 pilots, UAV pilots, in 50 countries around the world, recruited 2 of these teams, HeliWest and X-Craft, in order to complement the field-based surveys that the World Bank was doing with the government. So this was the data that they needed. They were carrying out on foot, paper, walking around the disaster-affected areas with questionnaires and so on. The World Bank wanted to help complement, not replace, but complement these field-based surveys, which can be quite time-consuming, data quality issues as well, and wanted to just have that aerial survey to put the two together. So that's exactly what we did. We primarily use multi-rotor UAVs, hexacopters, and quadcopters. And we worked very closely with, in fact, directly in partnership with the National Disaster Management Organization of Vanuatu. They told us where the priority areas were for these aerial surveys. And we had great collaboration with the Australian Defence Force Air Traffic Control because we were operating in a complex airspace, a non-segregated airspace, but it worked beautifully. No incident, 60-plus flights over the course of a couple of weeks. And of course, if you're familiar with UAVs, they are aerial robots. All these flights we did were autonomous, were basically us spending a lot of time between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. in the morning programming the flights for the next day, and then going to those locations and letting the robots do the work themselves. Now, what humanitarian organizations want is answers. They don't want a bunch of pretty pictures that come out of these aerial robotics platforms, right? They don't have time to look at all these pictures. They want to know which houses have been destroyed, where they're located. They don't want to look through 800 pictures. And here we have very quickly a major challenge back to our friend big data. Recent research at Texas A&M has shown that a single UAV flight, of a 20-minute UAV flight, can generate some 800 pictures. And it takes a professional trained imagery analyst over a minute to analyze each single high-resolution aerial image. So a single 20-minute flight will require 13 hours of time to analyze. And by the way, we're not just doing one flight. I told you we did about 60 flights in Vanuatu. And sure enough, when we were handing our flash disks, hard disks over to the GIS team in Vanuatu at the end of every day, they just had no bandwidth. I mean, those flash disks were going to stay there for a week, if not longer. So we reached out to digital humanitarians. We activated the World Bank activated the digital humanitarian network. And our partners at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap got to work, and they did what they do best, is do this kind of imagery analysis and tracing. So all the red here are houses that are fully destroyed, yellow, partially damaged, and blue, largely intact. So they were able to basically help create a search capacity to make sense of this big data, while our GIS colleagues at the World Bank and at the government were just swamped with other data. Now, it's not only nadir imagery that we collected as well oblique imagery. So that's when you put the camera at an angle. And the reason you want to do that is it's far more useful for disaster damage assessments to actually see the structures of the buildings and the houses. When you do nadir imagery and you're just looking straight down, like we're familiar with satellite imagery, you're just seeing really the roofs, and that's what you're assessing. It hides a lot of information. The challenge, though, was that Humanitarian OpenStreetMap cannot work with oblique images. They work with orthorectified mosaics. So we decided to revisit our good friend MicroMappers. We sliced up the imagery, posted it to MicroMappers, and the same deal as the wildlife search in Namibia, asked this time our digital volunteers to trace the houses that are fully destroyed, partially damaged, and so on. And yet again, the digital humanitarian, the digital Jedis delivered. Within a few days, thousands and thousands of aerial images had been analyzed. And if you go to the map, which is still online, just give you an example. Blue traces here are the largely intact buildings. And we're not talking about satellite imagery. We're talking about very high resolution aerial oblique imagery, which really allows you to do this kind of damage analysis. This is just some more outputs of the results, and we shared everything with our World Bank colleagues in the government of Vanuatu, and then we went back to those computer vision students in Switzerland and said, hey, this animal detection stuff you guys did, do you want to give it a shot here? And they were really game and really eager. So they took all the traces, and this is research we haven't published yet. It's in the works. We've too much going on. But we're at a point where we can automatically detect whether an aerial oblique image has a house or a shelter in it. And this is not trivial because unlike satellite imagery, which is very consistent, always vertical, always looking down, right, taken at the same time of day, with this you're talking about really wild data. You're talking about different angles of oblique, different altitudes, different time of day, different weather. It's actually really not trivial at all. So big props to EPFL for having gotten us this far. And increasingly what we can do with UAVs is get the imagery in real time, whether live video or live pictures. And so what we've done here is we got a lot of videos from Vanuatu, and we partnered with the University of Southampton to use MicroMappers to crowdsource the analysis of live aerial video footage for the damage assessment. And when you see here, all these clicks are hundreds of volunteers who are clicking on the video footage where they see damage. And everywhere where about 80% of volunteers are clicking, we light that up. So it's basically a real-time heat map that provides an immediate feedback loop to the pilot and to the humanitarian organization as to where the damage is. And what we want to do next is use all that and use the results for machine learning purposes and so on. And it's not just an academic exercise. The fact of the matter is that Vanuatu, if you go to the World Bank's risk index, Vanuatu is the #1 most disaster-prone country on this planet. And because of the El Nino effect projected to be one of the strongest El Nino effect in 50 years, there's going to be some disproportionate impact, again, in the Pacific. So it's a race against time in taking this geodata and using machine learning to see if we can actually help automate some of this feature detection. I want to end my talk with going back to Nepal. This is a picture I took not the week after the earthquake, but literally just a few weeks ago. I was in Nepal where I spearheaded a disaster recovery UAV mission with a number of phenomenal partners. Kathmandu University, Kathmandu Living Labs, DJI, and Pix4D. And the first part of our mission was to train students at Kathmandu University. And basketball courts are always great to train for UAVs. So we trained some 30 students from the engineering department, as well as faculty, as well as representatives of local and international NGOs, such as Engineers Without Borders, took part in the training, and we even had time to train some mini monks along the way. They were supposed to play football. There were 40 of them, but they were just like, screw football, we're going to play with these toys. So it was really a lot of fun, and it was fun to just share what we were doing and why we were doing what we were doing and so on. And importantly, and this is a big thanks to our technology partners, we were not only able to transfer the skills and transfer the technology, and local empowerment is a really big issue, goes to the heart of what we do at the Humanitarian UAV Network. But we were able to also donate 10 of these Phantoms as well as software to go with it. So that was the training part, but then we also had the Humanitarian UAV mission part, where we partnered directly with the local community in an area that was most severely affected by the earthquake. And you can see, this is just from a few weeks ago, right? Not April. There's so much rebuilding to be done still. There's so much rubble to still clear. I don't have the time to go through the whole mission, and I could give the whole keynote on just this mission, so I'll invite you to read it up on my blog where I provide more details and so on. I'll just share some highlights with you here. Now, it's important to note that we were invited by the local community. So a phenomenal group, the Community Disaster Management Committee of Kirtipur, had asked us to carry out these aerial surveys to help them rebuild better, rebuild smarter, and rebuild faster. And it's important to note that everything we did was directly in partnership, equal partnership with our local partners. They're the ones who have the local knowledge, right? We have no idea where to fly. They're the ones who informed the flight plans. They are the ones who told us where to take off from, how high to fly, and so on. So they were really instrumental. We could not have pulled this off on our own. And at the end of the mission, as we were walking back to the vans to pack up and head back to the university, local representatives came up to us somewhat a little nervous and said, so you are coming back tomorrow, right? And frankly, no, we were on a tight schedule, we had a lot to do, everything was, had to be done at the right time. And I said, well, we weren't planning on it. Why? It's because, and they replied, because you haven't finished. Here you are patting yourselves on the back. You've only covered 30% of the imagery we need. We need the other 70%. This is not good enough. And it kind of threw a wrench in our plans, right? But goodness, what the perfect wrench, right? Because it was exactly informing us that what we were doing was really important and they needed this data. And they mustered up the courage because they didn't want to offend us at the same time, but they really said, listen, we really need you back. So I had to cancel my flight back out of Nepal and stayed on a few extra days. And we came back the next day and we mapped literally from sunup to sundown. We didn't even take a lunch break. We just nonstop mapping. This is the areas that we covered through 30, 40 flights in total. And thanks to the Pix4D, we stitched all this imagery together in this high-resolution orthorectified mosaic of the town of Panga. And we are talking about high-resolution aerial imagery. Again, we're not restricted to satellite imagery. We go right down to this level. Now compare this, right, to what our local community partners were working off, namely Bing Maps and Google Earth. This is what they had to deal with. Not only is it out of focus and not high resolution, it's also out of date, and they can't update it themselves. So this empowerment strategy is really, really key. And you're not limited to 2D either. Because of all these flights at different altitudes, we were able to create these very high resolution 3D models that are all geo-referenced, and that's really important again. Actionable data, you have to have geo-referencing. And not just static 2D maps, but also dynamic 3D fly-through models where you can literally go down and fly through the town of Panga and do the assessment from all angles, right? Because after all, disaster damage is a 3D phenomenon. It really takes things to the next level when we're able to do that. And what we want to do next, and this is, we need so much help on all of this. This is all very new pilots. We're trying this out. It's not perfect. But we want to crowdsource the analysis of 3D models. This is a 3D model of a square in downtown Kathmandu after the earthquake. Crowdsource the analysis, the annotation of these 3D models. And in fact, we want to take it one step further. And so if anybody knows how to do this next step, please let me know. We want to take these 3D models and we want to go straight into virtual reality. We want, instead of having our 3,000 digital volunteers from all around the world tracing 2D maps, 2D imagery on micromappers, we want them to put on their VR headsets and walk down Kathmandu and do the disaster damage inspections in the 3D environment. Because 2D is so hard to analyze. It's why you need training to analyze 2D images. It's not intuitive. You lose a lot of information when you go to 3D to 2D. But we're all very familiar with 3D. We live in a 3D environment. We live in a 3D world. And that's going to make it much easier and help democratize the ability of more people to analyze. So imagine if we had 3,000 digital humanitarians walking down Kathmandu within a few days of the disaster and annotating within this environment. If you know how to do that, we really want to do a pilot. Definitely let us know. Now, there's again a flip side to all of this. Obviously, our local partners in Nepal don't have access to this technology, at least not yet. They also don't have access to laptops and computers and so on. So this data was locked in. This data was not going to be accessible to them. And I was not going to leave Nepal until we did something about it, to try and unlock and liberate this data. So what I decided to do was take this imagery, go to a local banner shop, and print out these maps on these large, giant, waterproof, rollable banners. And we decided to do this instead of paper, because paper rips, and when the monsoon seasons hit, it gets wet, and we wanted something durable. So we brought this back. After the community seeing us fly for 3 days, nonstop, they could see the results. We brought that right back to the local community, and we invited them to discuss the map, to discuss what they saw. We started doing what is very much part of your field, PPGIS, Public Participatory GIS, or community mapping. So I sat down with our local representatives and wrote down, pardon the bad handwriting, the different features that were of interest to them, that what kind of information they wanted to crowdsource from the local community. And then we invited the local community to annotate the map directly in the real world, in the solid world, to actually take ownership over the process. So we got a bunch of different colored pieces of paper and tape and scissors and invited them to map those features. Where is the rubble? Where are the houses that are too dangerous to live in? Where are the resources for public health, clean water, and so on? And the response was just one of the most amazing experiences of my life. Dozens and dozens and dozens of local community members coming together for more than 4 hours, discussing the map, discussing the priorities. How should we rebuild? Where do we rebuild first? Where do we have areas where we can have shelters in case we've got another disaster that happens, right? So they were already talking about disaster preparedness and disaster risk reduction. And unlike having a tiny little tablet or computer and trying to get the whole community behind you to interact, it doesn't work with that, right? But here you could really democratize and invite the whole community to add their social intelligence layer on top of this map that had been produced by aerial robotics, right? You could really bring it back to the real world, to where it mattered a lot. And like I said, but when we left, people were still discussing the map and the rebuilding efforts and so on. So that's my story. We need a lot of help, and it's not just about one data type, right? It's about taking different data sources and creating that information stack and leveraging crowdsourcing, leveraging citizen science, leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning to make sense of these different data sources and help fuse all this data into some kind, I don't know what it would look like, and this is where I need your help, integrated, multi-layered map that helps us to also enrich the contextual analysis. Having tweets that we overlay on aerial imagery can be quite powerful, or pictures from mobile phones that we overlay on satellite imagery can be really powerful to triangulate and cross-reference data. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to take all this information and make sense of it. I don't even know if it's possible or if we could come up with something that's useful, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. And to close, again, I can't stress this enough. This is very much a human story and a story about open data and open sharing and coming together as a community of digital humanitarians. And so I hope that I've convinced you that anybody can be a digital humanitarian. It really is very, very easy. So I really welcome and invite you to be a part of this open community and help us do this work better and faster in the future. Anybody can be a digital Jedi. Thank you very much.